Hello there, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today's video we're going to be talking about logic apps and options for hybrid integration scenarios with logic apps. So the idea is I'm building an integration solution with logic apps. I need to have some kind of network connectivity to be able to call a service inside that network. So that network could be in the cloud, it could be on premise. Today we're looking at what are my options for different ways I can achieve this, and we'll discuss some of the pros and cons of each of the ways. Now, if we think about our enterprise integration platform, so the technologies that we're thinking about here are definitely logic apps. So shrink my pen a little bit. We're thinking about things like Azure functions, VNet integration, data gateways, API management. We're going to touch on Data Factory and APIM a little bit. There's quite a number of different ways you can do this depending on what you're trying to achieve. So let's have a look at some of these options. So the first thing is we've got VNet integration with a WS1 plan. So this would look like here, you can see I've got three different logic apps up in Azure. They all belong to this plan. So a WS1 plan is a flavor of an app service plan, and Logic App Standard can have VNet integration configured just the same as other things on app service. Now, what I would be doing here is I would be setting up VNet integration on these particular applications. They would integrate with an Azure virtual network, and then I could call a component that has network line of sight from the subnet that my logic apps integrate with. Now, there's a couple of points to note here. So firstly, this VNet integration's on a per app basis. So if you notice the middle one, I didn't actually connect that to the virtual network where the other two I did. Now, the questions that we have here are, can this be used from logic app consumption? So move that out of the way. So that would be a no. This is really only for logic app standard. And when we're doing scenarios here for this is going to be quite a common sort of integration scenario. So you're going to be using a logic app connector, and it's going to be one of the built-in connectors. So this is going to have to be executing on the actual plan / inside the app. So when you think about that, what that really means is if you have like a cloud connector, so a cloud connector might be something like the Dataverse connector. So when your logic app calls out to the Dataverse connector, it then calls onto Dataverse. The execution down here doesn't live on the node that you've connected to the virtual network, whereas if you're using the built-in connectors over here, they execute inline in the app, which means they can leverage the functionality. So there'll be a bunch of connectors that you can use. So the cons here, one of them is going to be limited connectors. Now you do have, just going to call this out here, you do have the service provider model. So that's one of the ways that you can build your own connectors that can run as part of your logic apps. So they would be able to run over here. So you could almost like write some code that would do the connectivity. I would guess that you probably, with the logic apps inline code features now, you could probably do the similar thing there as well. Although I'm going to guess that's probably not recommended by Microsoft to do that. So the pros is that once you've got the networking set up, those connectors should be easy to use. So things like your SQL connector, I guess there's like a file connector, if I remember right, and a few other ones that you can use that are these built-in connectors that can leverage the VNet connectivity. HTTP connector will be another example. There's no real extra cost for this VNet connectivity here. So your WS1 plan, you're going to have a cost for that anyway. There might be some small network traffic costs, but it shouldn't be a substantial cost. certainly versus any of the other options, and it wouldn't put a significant extra cost on top of what you'd be paying anyway. So this one's kind of like, it's really a green light option if you're using Logic Apps Standard. The next option we've got, it's very similar. So this one's going to be VNet integration, but this time your Logic App's living on an ASE. Now you'll notice, I'm going to just go backwards for a second, notice the difference in the diagram here, particularly where the network piece is. So here we've got 3 Logic Apps, and they all live on the app service environment. And the key difference is that we connect the app service environment to the network, and that gives it line of sight to this component. So all of these apps here, by nature of being on the app service plan, have line of sight to that component. So that really is the difference is you set the networking up once, versus here you would set it up on every single app. Now this one, every app gets network integration, even if you want it or not, just by being on the plan. So there's a subtle difference there. Cost-wise, I've got a big video comparing ASE and WS1 plans. So cost-wise, there's not a huge amount in it nowadays after the newest versions of those plans. I think it's worth looking at an ASE if you're a Logic App customer, and hopefully my other video will check that out. Now the key thing over here, we can't use this from consumption, we can use it from standard. It's the same scenario as before, so you want those connectors that are built in. Pros of this option are simpler networking. So that certainly if you're going to have multiple apps that need the networking, it's definitely going to be simpler. If you're just having one Logic app, there's not much in it. I'm not really sure off the top of my head, I'd say there's any major cons on this one. What did we say on the last slide? Limited connectors, so you've still got that, limited connectors. The service provider model would work, the inline code theoretically would work as well. And this again should be a green light if you run on an ASE with VNet connectivity. Obviously there is an assumption that this component is addressable through the VNet, but that one's pretty straightforward. Now we're going to start looking into ones where if you have different scenarios that either one, use a connector that you can't put on the VNet integration, or two, you're on a cloud customer who doesn't have a big investment in Azure network connectivity. So for example, in the previous one, actually, I guess one of the limitations here might be there's a dependency that you've got something like a VPN or some kind of express route or something where you've connected your on-premise network to your Azure network. If you have, I've worked with a few companies, certainly a few years ago, who'd have some networked resources in Azure, but they hadn't gone as far as connecting the cloud and on-premise networks yet. So you may hit some stumbling blocks if you haven't done those bigger networking pieces. On-prem data gateway. So here we've got a Logic app in Azure. We've got a connector, which I guess we probably should draw on the diagram here. So we've got a connector, and it will be a cloud connector. The Logic app uses that cloud connector, but it's configured to go through the gateway. So you've provisioned a gateway on Azure. You've installed, so on here you'd have a VM that's part of your network, and you've installed the software for the data gateway. That would then come online, open an outbound bidirectional connection to the cloud data gateway, and then when you make a call from your Logic app, it'll go through the gateway and it'll start executing on this VM down here, and then you could, because your VM's probably on the network, you can go through the VNet to access this component. Now the good thing is, because it's a cloud connectors feature, you're good for consumption and standard Logic apps, but you can only use it with the connectors that support it. So call out an example of a connector that doesn't support it. Quite a common one we get blocked with is if you've got an on-premise only SFTP server. That SFTP connector doesn't support the data gateway, so you can't use this pattern, which is one of the places I've been blocked on that. But otherwise, it's mature. It's been around for years. I'm not sure what the right way to say be around for years in a positive way, but it's mature, it's reliable. There's quite a few connectors, so things like the SAP connector, some of the the enterprise connectors. I'll leverage that gateway. There is an HA story for it, so you can install multiple VMs that all connect to the same gateway to give you some scalability and resilience in that. I guess some of the cons. So if you've been through the process of setting this up, so I'm going to write Power BI and Power App there now. When you set it up, what you'll find is you end up having to use the admin for Power Platform, Power BI area to do some of the management operations for the gateway. So for some bizarre reason, I guess the history of the data gateway is it was built initially by the Power BI team and then got used by a lot of other teams. And some of their management features are in the Power Platform admin area, so just be aware of that. It's not really a major blocker, it's just a different portal that you just probably want to be aware of. The scenarios here are things like enterprise, connectors. There's quite an interesting scenario here about if you're using Windows authentication. So one of the things would be if you're doing an HTTP call to this component here, if that uses Windows authentication, one of the challenges is that sometimes some of the authentication schemes will support you being able to provide like a basic credential, but if you've got NTLM authentication, the problem is your logic app up here isn't on the domain, so you can't do like a Kerberos-based authentication. So if your component, your gateway is installed here, what can happen is the call can go through, and I can't remember the name of the connector. I think it's the web HTTP connector or something like that, where you can actually get it to use a Windows credential down here. So you can do that Windows authentication into the backend component. We've used that a couple of times and it works quite well. I guess maybe one of the things would be here, think about load. I must say, I don't know that I've worked on a scenario with a data gateway that's been under high constant load, and I'm not sure how that would perform. I would guess it's using Service Bus Relay behind the scenes, which can get pretty decent performance out of it. So I think if you've got enough VMs listening and you've got a decent back-end system, you can probably do some quite decent load. But I certainly have not run it at a high volume that I could give any figures for. So just maybe bear in mind that you want to think about that as a something to just experiment with if you're considering this pattern. Sorry, I think I've jumped ahead a bit. So there we go, API management. So I've used this pattern quite a lot. So here we've got a logic app, we're calling API management. We have API management is in the premium or dev SKU. And that API management is then connected to a virtual network, and it's able to call a service that lives inside that network. So really easy to use pattern, particularly if you already have the premium API management. You've got like services that you can leverage for other stuff, but you can use it for this hybrid use case. It is going to be HTTP only. So you're not going to be able to do like an FTP or a file connectivity. Um, you can use this for both consumption and standard logic apps because you don't, from a logic app perspective, you don't really care about that network, and you're leveraging the fact that your other Azure resources and API management already has the networking set up. So I've worked with a few customers where we have a lot of API based traffic, and you can just continue to use consumption logic apps and just leverage APIM to sort that networking requirement out for you. Um, so pros, leverage. And then you get all the benefits of the APIM. So if you've got like the log and the security and all that kind of thing, um, I I guess one of the cons is cost to a degree. So if you don't have APIM already for other things, a premium SKU for APIM is quite expensive. So if you're not going to be using it for other stuff, this may not be a green light for you. You might want to think about whether you're getting good value for money. But if you definitely have other API requirements that you would reuse the API management for, definitely a one to think about. The dev SKU can do hybrid, but it's not. The dev SKU is a lot cheaper, but it's obviously not supported for production scenarios. And the standard SKU, I think last time I checked, it didn't support the networking requirement at this point in time. Okay, so next up we've got functions. So this is very similar to the logic app one earlier. The only difference is we've got a logic app that calls a function. The function could either live on an app service plan or it could live on an ASE. So if you had that logic app standard plan on an ASE, you could put a function there that would leverage the network connectivity, and you'd be able to get down to this component down here. Now, if you already have a function plan that has support for VNet, so things like an Elastic Premium or an ASE or I think Standard, if I remember right, Premium certainly supports it. Pretty good option, especially if you've got a scenario where you've got a connector that's not really supported. So things like that SFTP one that we quite often get blocked on. You could do a function in here that's a reusable helper function that can talk over your SFTP port down to your SFTP server, and you just call it from a logic app. It's easy to call from a logic app. So logic app to function is very easy. The functions VNet's easy. That's really good. So number one, it's good for, especially I guess if you're thinking about even HTTP traffic where you didn't have a data gateway, you didn't have APIM, and you didn't have VNet support. You could spin a function app up, set up that, and do some kind of HTTP proxy in your function app. So you could achieve that at a lower cost than doing API management if you had that requirement, but you didn't have the budget available to buy APIM, and you were maybe on logic app consumption, for example, instead of standard. So you've got quite a lot of options. I think like regardless of what kind of platform you're building, I think especially if you have an ASE, this option of having functions on a plan to be able to do VNet, I think is like a bit of a Swiss Army knife of giving you a lot of capability to deal with obscure options. So you can do, anything you can do in .NET Core, pretty much you could do in the function app. You can call it from consumption, you can call it from standard. Con wise, I don't think there's a huge amount of cons with this. It's a bit of a kind of safety net option, as I say, Swiss Army knife. It's maybe more code. So you are going to be using custom code to do these calls from a function app. Sometimes that's an advantage for some teams, sometimes it's a disadvantage. But certainly if you haven't got a connector, this gives you a lot of good things to think about. Okay, so next we've got service bus queue with a custom listener. So here, a good example, right? Here we're going to have a VM in this network, and it's going to have this custom code on it here. Now, why would you have a VM with custom code when you've got a function? I think is question number one. So you will get sometimes a scenario where you've got a dependency for some library, some driver, some custom software you might want to use, where you need to be on a VM. So an example I recently was working with a piece of software where I had to have a bunch of third-party stuff installed for my C# code to talk to a time series database. I couldn't install those libraries on an app service plan. Therefore, I couldn't use functions to be able to do that. So in this option, what I could do is I could put like a Windows service on here, and basically what would happen is my Logic app could make a call to a queue. I could then pull messages from here. I could do some work against this component, and then I could put response messages, and my Logic app could just listen for responses. And that would be like an async pattern where I could do load leveling. I could have my custom component, could even scale out on this VM if we had more VMs. And that would give me a good way of kind of doing something where I needed quite a bit of custom code. So this option could work from Logic app consumption, could work from standard. You're going to want this where you need async. So you're going to fire a message. You may or may not get a response back. So the big con is it's going to be custom code. The big benefit on here is I'm not going to say no networking, but well, I guess you've got the networking, that the VMs in the network, but I'm not having to think about the networking really from the perspective of getting inside the network. So this Windows service, it makes outbound bidirectional connections to these queues, so I can push and pull messages, but I'm not exposing. Let me just rub that out a minute. Didn't want to do that. Give me a second. So it's pretty good. Let me get my pen back. So we don't have like an inbound, if let's say we were trying to attack that from outside the network, you couldn't really do that because it's not exposed publicly. It's just got this listener listening for messages. So it's quite good from a security perspective. Because you might even have like managed identity for, if this was an Azure VM, you might have managed identity on those queues, but it could also just be an on-prem VM, and there might be no Azure network at all. Would be a good scenario. A lot of those options previously required that you had a VPN of some kind between your on-prem network and Azure. This one would avoid that. But the biggest challenge here is what do you feel about this custom code you're going to write? How are you going to support it? If that's comfortable within your skill sets, this is quite a good option for triggering async on-premise jobs. And these jobs could be they could be just export jobs. They could be go and do some change to some system, something like that. We also have an option for a very similar pattern, but this time we've got this VM. It's got our Windows service on. It opens an outbound connection to a service bus relay, and then the Logic app calls the relay, and it's expecting a response back in like an RPC pattern, and the VM calls through the network, does something, and returns a response. So this is probably going to be HTTP based in most cases. This VM could be in Azure. It may be just in a standard on-prem network. You've got the same sort of security considerations is the queues where you're making the outbound connections. The VM's not publicly exposed. It's making a call and listening. You do also have, so you could use it for an HTTP relay to get on-prem. You could also use this for, there's a pattern with relay called port bridge. So you can kind of use that to make your own sort of version of that data gateway. But the key thing here is there's a message coming down that triggers some of your custom code here and you do something. Now, the one thing that I really like about this pattern is it's easy to get up and running really quickly without having to deal with a lot of infrastructure related stuff. So as long as you've got a VM and can listen to the relay, so it's quick and low complexity. You know, one of the things we think about a lot today is the time it takes to deliver some value. So if I want to query an on-prem database and give some data back to my logic app, this is probably one of the quickest ways you can get from zero to integrated, which I think is good. And you know, maybe with Relay we don't use it as much these days because of the network, and most companies are so much further on with the networking for hybrid scenarios than they used to be a few years back. But there was scenarios, 10 years ago when we were doing early Azure solutions. We did that integration in a day thing where we connected an on-prem system to a cloud integration through Relay, and we went from zero to integrated in one day. This one also has a low cost. So you're going to be paying per, by the connections and by messages, a bit like on the Q1. These are, unless you're going to send thousands and millions of messages through there, the costs are going to be based on consumption. So the more you use it, the more you pay. But generally, the costs are going to be pretty low. The cons for this one really are because it's custom code. But again, that can also be an advantage. Those scenarios where you need to do something a bit different, where the connectors being protocol based, they have some constraints that they have to work in, whereas your custom code can solve a lot of those constraints. A really good example here actually might be if we compare the gateway to the relay. So if I had a SQL database down here and I had to make, let's say I've got my data gateway here. If I had to query quite a bit of data, one of the challenges might be I have to make, 10 calls to put together a data set. Each one's hitting the database, and then I have to do a lot of crafting of that data set up here. So that can be a really inefficient way to do it. Whereas this way, I could make one call that says, give me the data set, and then my round trips from C# to the database could be really low because I'm in the network. I've got quite close proximity, so they should be a lot quicker, and I'm not having to run through a cloud gateway to get all these different bits of data to build a data set. So there could be significant latency improvements for your integration by the fact that you have this custom code. This one can be used from consumption, can be used from standard. Next up, we've got Data Factory. So here we've got the Data Factory in Azure. Our logic app calls Data Factory. That then triggers a job that goes and runs on an integration runtime. Now that integration runtime can be on a managed network. So if you've got VNet integration with your Azure hosted one with a managed runtime, or you've got a custom VM with a self-hosted runtime, you could have line of sight to your SQL database in the network. Your Data Factory job executes here, and let's say it pushes data out to the cloud SQL database. And then when your logic app sees the jobs run, it can go and query the cloud database, or it could, there's a whole bunch of patterns that you can do once you've got the job executed about whether it's pushing data somewhere or whatever it's doing with it. But the fact that you can go through Data Factory to execute a job inside the network is a good option. So this could be used from consumption, could be used by standard. This bit here is really using probably a cloud connector, but you could trigger it via the Azure Management API would be another option. I think with this scenario here, this is going to be where you're likely to want to trigger an export or import of big data sets. So let's say here I'm going to run a big query to get, a million rows out of this SQL and push them over into this cloud SQL, or I'm going to pull a file in from over here. I'm going to bulk import that file and load it into here, something like that. I don't see you would be doing this on a transactional message type scenario. It's going to be much more move a big set of data. Maybe one option might be your integration runtime job in Data Factory debatches this huge file of data and pops messages on a function or a service bus queue or something. It might be something you do, but again, it's that ETL ELT type job you want to trigger from a logic app. One of the things you might be thinking about, you sometimes get people work with pretty big data sets in a logic app, and you might be trying to put them in this database. Let's say you're doing it through a data gateway. So let's kind of draw that on. Let's say I've got 10,000 rows, 20,000 rows. So I might put a message together, put it through the data gateway, execute a stored proc on my SQL database and load that data. Now, if that 20,000 rows becomes a million, 2 million, 10 million, that logic app and data gateway is going to struggle really quickly. You might be far better triggering a job and having the Data Factory job, which is designed to work with these big messages, do all that work on an integration runtime would be a far better thing, and then have the logic app just orchestrate the process across triggering that job and then doing some work after it. So I think to me the pros and cons is not really a huge amount to put here. It's just use the right pattern. Sometimes I see a scenario where a team uses a pattern just because it's what they're used to all the time, whereas maybe having 2 or 3 additional patterns in your toolkit might help you pick the right tool for the right job. That's a great example of if you're only used to building logic app solutions and you pull your big data set through your gateway, suddenly the data set grows and you've got a problem. But it can work just as easily the other way, where you do everything in Data Factory, and if you can inefficiently use your Data Factory, which might be costing you money if you're not using it well or something. The pros are both the self-hosted and managed VNet options on Data Factory. Once they're set up, it's so the setup is pretty easy. It's reusable across your Data Factory, so you can use it for other integration scenarios. I think that it's definitely a pattern I would have in my toolkit for the right use cases. Okay, now we've got automation accounts. These are one of the more obscure ones that I think, unless you're doing an IT admin automation kind of workload, you may not have thought about this one, but again, in the right use case, it can be quite effective. So here what we've got is we've got an automation account and a logic app. My logic app triggers a job in my automation account. And in this scenario, we're talking about the hybrid worker. So an automation account can have an agent that runs on a VM that can be on-prem or it can be in your Azure VNet. The job goes and runs here. It has network line of sight. Let's pretend you've got an Exchange server it's doing some work against. So your runbook could be doing something like PowerShell. You've got a bunch of scripting language choices there, but let's say you're doing a PowerShell runbook. It executes on the network. The logic app knows where the job's finished, so it can go and do some stuff. So this gets triggered via a cloud connector, so it's available for both flavors of Logic App. I think you would tend to use this for IT automation type integrations. But you're in PowerShell world, so anything in that network you can do with PowerShell theoretically is open. So it's a pretty, one of the pros would be it's pretty generic. So it gives you lots of choices. If you could call, I don't know, you could call HTTP from PowerShell. You could push a message to Service Bus. You've got quite a lot of options there. You do have things like input and output parameters for the Logic app as well. But again, I think this one could the biggest con about this one, probably not a con, but more just a challenge, is going to be it's likely to cross teams. So you might have a scenario where your IT automation engineer or DevOps people are using the Logic app and using the the automation account. But if you have a scenario where your enterprise integration teams over here, this is more likely to be done by your IT automation team or your IT admin team. So that the automation account's definitely a slightly different context what an integration person is going to be used to. Now, the good thing is, let's say you've got IT process optimation going on. So it's quite feasible that your IT admin could build a library of services in an automation account that your integration team could just leverage and treat them just like any other API service. So for example, if you're doing like user onboarding and you need to do all these admin activities to set people up and stuff, you could just have your integration team could build onboarding processes and then they could just call the automation account would be really good. So I think in the right scenarios, this could be pretty cool. There is a slightly different flavor of the integration account as well. So one of the differences, the big thing to note here, this previous one, the job runs here. So it's a bit like Data Factory in a way. We trigger a job here, but it actually runs on this machine because there's a worker agent on it. The difference here is the Logic app triggers the automation account, but here what we've got is just an Azure VM where an automation account can do a remote execution of a PowerShell script on that VM. So there's no software or agent installed here. It's just a remote execute. So you would have this VM would have a role. I can't remember the exact name of the role, but there's like a PowerShell execute role that you could give to the managed identity for your automation account. That would let it, and you could just put half a dozen PowerShell scripts on here, and then you could have that VM does a remote execute of something on your Exchange would be an example. So again, that's going to be the same IT automation. That would be IT automation type use cases you would be looking at. This one would only really work if you had it needs an Azure VM. So if you don't have an Azure VM to remote execute to, you wouldn't have line of sight here, so that would be a blocker. To be honest, the only time I've ever seen this used was a bit of an obscure use case with a customer who just didn't have a hybrid worker or anything. That would be an option to use. So I think that hybrid worker is probably more likely. But just be aware that this is an option if you had the right use case. You could think about it. Now, next we've got a combo solution. Sorry, I want to just check. Yeah, this one, I thought I missed this. So just to confirm, that one is available for both types of Logic apps. So now we've got a combo solution. So what we've got here is a consumption Logic app and a standard Logic app. The standard Logic app lives on an app service it has VNet integration, and it then can call that in-network component. So what you might do as a design pattern is you might build a layer of data integrations. So you build like a library of sort of operations, CRUD type operations or something like that. Build them in Logic Apps standard so you can leverage the network connectivity. You may or may not put an APIM on top. And then you could actually have either Logic Apps standard or Logic App consumption might build process orchestrations that leverage these API services. And that would allow you, if you had a hybrid, so if you had a hybrid solution combining both Logic App standard and Logic App consumption, you could leverage a pattern which was these data services and reuse them across multiple Logic Apps. So this would be, you would definitely need Logic App standard for implementing the pattern, but then you could use that from consumption as well. You couldn't really do this. I'll put a little star here. You couldn't do that really with just Logic App consumption on its own. Maybe you could do it if you had the data gateway, possibly you could argue, but I think it's more likely to be this way. So it would be a pattern data API type services. So you'd have good reuse. So you could reuse that get customer. You could reuse across multiple integrations. There's a bit more complexity here. But then I guess you could also argue your reusable services would mean you're not having every integration has to deal with the hybrid scenario. You're just doing it in your data services. So there's pros and cons of each. And the last pattern I think we're going to talk about is I've got so pretend this is my main network here. I've got an API here, so maybe I've built a service of some kind. I talk to my database. I then have something in my DMZ. So maybe I've got some more services, or I've got some kind of router that forwards messages on. And my Logic Apps can make a public call through my public firewall. And then my routing can take it through my DMZ and into my main network. Now, this one you could use from consumption, you could use from standard. I guess this is a pattern we see less nowadays than we used to see. Unless you've already got this in place, you're probably not going to use this pattern because the hybrid options to go through VNet integration or one of the other options would be more like a better choice usually because they're more specific to what you're trying to do. Whereas this is more, you had a lot of your environment on premise to begin with, so you've got your own DMZ, and you're exposing services that way. I think we'll tend to see more of the other options in the future, but this one would be probably reusing existing stuff. The pros, I mean, there's a lot. The big thing from a Logic App perspective, it's actually not a bad solution because you're pretty simple. You're just calling API. So if I think purely from this perspective here, it's actually a quite nice pattern because everything's somebody else's problem. So I'll put that LA equals easy because you're probably just calling an HTTP endpoint. The big cons are all of the other infrastructure. So the chances are somebody in the organization is going to be maintaining this. There's a big effort to maintain, the infrastructure, the application code, etc. here, and they're probably, if they're like most companies, they're probably going to be shifting some of that to the cloud at some point. So you probably want to think about the roadmap. the roadmap for this. Where are they now? Where they're going to be in the medium and longer term? Because that might affect how you have to integrate with it. That's everything for today's talk. I just wanted to kind of have some thoughts down on some of those different options for solving the problem about getting from a logic app to a service inside a network, whether that be an Azure network or a hybrid Azure on-premise network. I think the key thing, what the reason I had these ones all, so we go right back to the start. The reason I had these ones at the start, this one here in the ESC, these are the ones most people are going to be using, probably by default for people using Logic App Standard. Be aware of the couple of different choices here, but then when you get these scenarios where these can't solve your problem, you've got all these other options that have been around for quite a while to help you with it. It's just knowing what are the pros and cons of each one and where the right places to use them are. So hopefully you enjoyed today's content. Please give me feedback if you think I've missed anything or I've missed an option or a comment on a particular option. If you'd like to see more videos like this, I'm always open for suggestions of what type of questions people are struggling to answer in the integration world, and maybe me or I can reach out to a few people and have some discussions about stuff that listeners would find really interesting. Thanks for today. Cheers.